First question asked is, why should English Premier League clubs be willing to give more TV money away to EFL clubs? First point that I'd like to mention is that football clubs are community assets. Not only does financial inequality hinder their chances of progressing up the pyramid, but it also increases the likelihood of lower league clubs entering administration and liquidation. The second reason is for the structural advantages that the Premier League has developed as a result of the EFL. It would be unfair for the Premiership not to give a greater proportion of its earnings to the EFL. The EFL is ultimately a breeding ground for players who may go on to play in the top flight, and therefore if you improve investment and opportunity for players in the EFL, it's possible that the talent available for Premiership recruitment could improve in future years by distributing more income to lower leagues. I would also mention the 2006 and 2011 reforms, which have entrenched the dominance of top flight clubs over lower league clubs. There's been a massive increase in broadcasting income, while simultaneously you've got reforms that have enabled the Premiership to benefit from the EFL and the wider pyramid. The final reason is that broadcasting income is not only where the greatest disparity in income lies between leagues, but it is also the easiest and most rational form of income to redistribute. I say this because self-negotiated commercial and sponsorship deals give the biggest clubs the most lucrative deals, and rightly so. However, broadcasting payments benefit the league as a whole and have grown out of proportion in recent years. The second question is the prospect of an independent regulator having such powers unrealistic? The answer is, for some reforms, yes, it is unrealistic, and for other reforms, no, it's not unrealistic. The independent regulator would be built off a licensing system under an Act of Parliament, which would require all teams to gain a licence under which they would have to agree to follow the rules of the regulator. In simple terms, every club has to get a licence to play in the Football League, and once they've got that licence, that means that they must follow the rules of the regulator and cannot influence the regulator like they can under the existing systems with Championship veto rights and the Premiership voting system. If you were able to resolve this conflict of interest where the regulators are influenced by those being regulated, I think that reforms to financial fair play and definitely the Elite Player Performance Programme would be feasible. However, there's other reforms such as replacing parachute payments with automatic salary adjustments, which would clearly clash with employment law, and so whilst it could be a potential solution, it's not straightforward. You'd need to give clubs a long time to prepare, and the chances are that you wouldn't be able to override the employment laws involved in that reform. The third question is, why did 46 out of 72 EFL clubs vote for the Elite Player Performance Programme? The answer is the FA's threat to withhold solidarity payments to the wider financial pyramid. So essentially the FA's interest was in giving the best academy players the best training so that they could play football at the best level to improve England's international setup and international competitiveness by giving them a better quality men's team to ensure that any talent stemming from the grassroots and the lower leagues can easily make that way into the top flight. However, there were clubs who voted against it, Charlton and Gillingham and Brentford being another, having directly lost players such as Josh Bohui and Ian Carlos Poveda as a result of the Elite Player Performance Programme. There were other clubs such as Notts County who did not vote because they did not want the threat of not receiving solidarity payments, but they also don't want to be seen supporting the Elite Player Performance Programmes. The English Premier League clubs will argue that the Elite Player Performance Programme gives clubs adequate compensation for academy players who make relatively insignificant contributions to the first team, but as we know, in reality it strips lower league clubs of their most valuable assets in return for meagre compensation fees, and that is the reason why you've got clubs such as Wycombe Wanderers, Brentford FC, who've chosen to replace their academies with a B team of senior players released by top flight clubs, because they decided, What's the point of developing talent through our youth academies if our youth talents can be stripped off us and we can't even negotiate a fair market fee for those players? Next question is, what are the loopholes in financial fair play and how has this changed over time? So the first key loophole is that clubs can disguise owners' equity as sponsorship income. The Premiership has a maximum acceptable loss limit of 105 million over 3 years, and the Championship has a maximum acceptable loss limit of 39 million over 3 years. And obviously equity is different to income. Income will tend to be included as income in your profit figures, whereas equity will not. And so if clubs are able to use equity in the form of generous sponsorship deals, then they can disguise this owner equity injection as being sponsorship income, and this income means that they're less likely to break financial fair play's loss limits. Second loophole is complicated club structures. Clubs can park their costs into separate vehicles. Manchester City pays no director salaries, but another structure under the same name pays £500,000. Other types of loopholes include sale and leaseback, particularly football stadiums. Derby County decided to sale and lease back Pride Park for 80 million to book a 39.9 million profit, even though the average house price in Derby was just 207,000. Other loopholes would include abbreviated accounts, changing the financial year end and bringing revenue from future years into current years, as well as using expected recoverable values to ignore straight line amortization expenses. For your point on how has it changed over time, previously they actually had squad salary caps of 2.5 million for League One and 1.5 million for League Two, though the average Championship squad salary was 34 million. I still think it's flawed now because League One clubs can't have wage control ratios over 60%, even though the Championship has an average wage control ratio of 120% and the Premiership 73%. The next question says, you mentioned the catchment area rule. How has the Elite Player Performance Programme changed, and has it changed for better or for worse? The catchment area rule meant that you could only sign under 18 players within your club's catchment area, which would have to be within a 90-minute drive of the club's training ground. And this for clubs without Cat 1 status. Thankfully, this was abolished 2 years ago. Now they've also imposed tariffs for each year spent at a club's academy from 9 to 11, as well as fees between £3,000 and £40,000, depending on academy status between the age of 9 and 16. But nonetheless, this compensation is largely insignificant. The next question says, which solutions from Project Big Picture and the Crouch Report did you reject and why? So one reform which I rejected was the Solidarity Transfer Levy, and the reason for this was because I believe it directly undermines international competitiveness and diverts spending to wages instead of transfers. If you had a 5% transfer levy on every transfer made for players to come into the Premier League from overseas, then it's going to make overseas transfers less attractive, and a lot of the talent in the Premier League, it has to be said, comes from overseas. And so when operating in competitions outside its jurisdiction, you don't want to diminish the value of the Premiership as a product by limiting the overseas talent. I also chose to reject the idea of a squad salary cap. You've seen this in sports such as the NBA, but however, football is a global sport with global competitions, and this means that restricting salaries in one league when they're not restricted in other leagues overseas is not feasible, because players will just move into leagues where the salary caps do not apply. It only works in the NBA because basketball is played domestically. The other reforms from Project Big Picture which I chose to reject were having £250 million as a loan as a share of future broadcasting payments to the FL. I believe this should be a donation, because if it's a loan, you're just increasing the debts of clubs with very high gearing ratios. The next reform that I rejected from Project Big Picture was to reduce the number of Premiership clubs from 20 to 18 and to scrap the Carabao Cup to ease fixture congestion. This reform doesn't really make sense because For clubs without European competitions, they would have less fixtures, less income, and this would just increase the gap in matchday income. The Carabao Cup contributes to 2/3 of the Sky Sports and EFL domestic broadcast deal, and so instead of receiving 100% of the 195 million deal, EFL clubs received a deal that was worth much less. The other reforms that I rejected were abolishing parachute payments, because whilst the idea is fantastic, I do believe that you would need to replace them with automatic salary adjustments, and due to the complications with employment law, this would be very difficult to implement. Last reform by Project Big Picture, which I chose to reject, was to allow 6 clubs to determine the whole future of the EFL. The EFL still deserves its independence from the Premier League, and we've seen what has happened when you allow those top 6 clubs to determine the reforms which will be imposed on the wider financial pyramid. Parachute payments, financial fair play, and elite player performance programme are prime examples of why this doesn't work. Next question is, what additional solutions not mentioned would you consider? So I'd look into debt versus equity injections, because I think that pure equity injections are much healthier than debt injections. My club, Charlton Athletic, is the best example that I could possibly think of when it comes to this, because we've had owners who have put 60 million into the club, in quotations, but what fans often didn't realise, told of the club's stadium and training ground unless his debt that he put into the club is repaid. The next question is, why does football need government intervention? The answer to this is very straightforward. Football clubs are community assets, and I refer back to the Charlton Athletic Community Trust team. They work in football and sports development, education, equality, diversity and inclusion, early help and prevention, health services, youth improvement, social action and enterprise would not have been possible without the football club. This is a charity which is built off the back of a football club, and as with many football clubs, if you strip away that football club, you strip away the community benefits that come with it. Final question is it better to implement reforms from the top down, i.e. from the Premier League to the lower leagues, or from the bottom up, i.e. from the grassroots going up to the Premier League? The answer is top down, because top is where the greatest inequalities lie. We've already seen the bottom up approach with financial fair play, where regulations have been strictly forced upon lower league sides and then gradually relaxed as you progress up the pyramid. The issue is that this gives those with the greatest power the least restrictions, and so to answer the concerns of fans of grassroots teams, I would say that we need to first tackle inequality where inequality is greatest and tackle those who are the most powerful before we address the inequalities at the bottom.